So the next time you're, sitting on a commercial flight, just looking out the window at the clouds at 30,000 feet.
Or maybe just complaining about the league room.
Right, or the Wi-Fi.
Mm.
But consider this for a second. Just a few feet directly beneath your seat, in that pressurized cargo hold, there is a very high probability that a highly regulated transfer of human remains is taking place.
It's, it really is a startling realization when you think about it.
It is, and honestly, given the subject matter today, you might feel like you've turned into the Welcome to the Funeral Channel Network podcast.
It does sound a bit morbid right out of the gate, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it totally does. But I promise, while it sounds dark, this is actually a deeply fascinating and highly practical deep dive into a completely hidden world.
The world that, frankly, almost all of us will intersect with at some point.
Exactly. So today, we are using a singular, incredibly informative source text. It's an essay titled, Transporting a Body Out of State, What Families Need to Know.
And our mission today is really about demystification.
Demystifying logistics, right.
Yeah, the logistics, the legalities, the physical preparations. Because when a loved one passes away far from home, it's not just a matter of booking a flight.
Not at all.
It's a massive, unforgiving, bureaucratic machine that just suddenly kicks into gear. And our goal is to arm you with knowledge about how that machine works.
Right, because grief is this universal guarantee. We're all going to face it.
Unfortunately, yes.
And let me tell you, being hit with a mountain of arcane bureaucratic hurdles during a tragedy, that is an absolute nightmare.
It completely compounds the trauma.
It does. So understanding this invisible infrastructure beforehand, it kind of acts as an emotional safety net, you know?
That's exactly it. Ignorance in the face of this system doesn't give you a pass. It just makes the collision so much harder.
Well, let's talk about that initial collision, actually, because the source material points out that a family is instantly plunged into an acute emotional crisis.
Right, the brain is just trying to process shock and profound sorrow.
But the legal and medical machinery around them doesn't care. It just demands forward momentum.
Yeah, they are thrust into an immediate crisis of logistics. And the very first step of that, the phrase that really anchors this whole process, is determining the final disposition.
Final disposition, it sounds so clinical.
It's incredibly clinical. And the system demands an answer to it almost immediately.
So what does that actually mean in practice?
Basically, it means, what is the ultimate legal and physical endpoint for this individual? Are they being buried in a cemetery 3 states away? Are they being cremated?
And the second you answer that, especially if it involved crossing a state line, you trigger this whole cascade of rules.
Exactly. You're mourning, your world is fractured. But the hospital administrators and the state health departments, they need an actionable plan right now.
I was thinking about this, and it's like being asked to pass a complex project management certification test on the literal worst day of your life.
That is a wildly accurate analogy.
Right. You're handed a clipboard and told to coordinate a multi-state logistics operation when you can barely remember how to tie your shoes.
Your executive function is just severely compromised by trauma. But this brings up a really fascinating psychological insight from the text.
Oh, about the clear communication.
Yeah, the text asserts that understanding the process, having that logistical transparency, actually provides clarity and reduces stress.
See, I want to push back on that a little bit.
Okay, how so?
Well, if I'm deeply grieving, someone handing me a bulleted list of airline compliance codes doesn't exactly feel like a warm hug, you know? How is that emotional triage?
I mean, it definitely doesn't feel like a warm hug.
Yeah.
But think about how the human mind spirals in grief. The unknown is terrifying.
That's true. The anxiety of not knowing what happens next.
Right. Every unanswered question, like where are they taking the body or are we doing something illegal, it amplifies anxiety into panic.
So having an expert step in and lay out the steps removes that burden.
Exactly. When someone says step 1 is the signature, step 2 is the permit, it breaks an abstract terror down into finite steps. That clarity is a form of compassionate care.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You're removing the friction so people can actually just focus on grieving.
Precisely. But the friction we are talking about is intense, especially on the legal side.
Oh, the legal side is wild. The text calls it a 2-state legal labyrinth.
It is completely unyielding. To legally transport a body across state lines, you need a certified death certificate and a burial transit permit.
And the text explicitly says that without these documents, transportation cannot legally proceed. Period.
Full stop. There are 0 exceptions for grief.
So the death certificate, I get. A medical professional signs it, it goes to the state. But this burial transit permit is fascinating.
It's a really deep structural legal concept. Both the originating state and the receiving state have to authorize it.
Wait, so a deceased person basically needs a highly regulated legal passport just to cross a domestic border.
That is exactly what it is, a passport for passing.
But why both states? Why does it matter so much?
Well, think about the originating state. They are legally discharging the individual. They need a guarantee that the cause of death is verified, that there's no foul play.
Right, you can't just have bodies disappearing across borders. That sounds like a true crime documentary waiting to happen.
Exactly. They are signing off on the exit to make sure you aren't circumventing a criminal investigation.
And then the receiving state needs to authorize the entry.
Yeah, they're importing the remains. They need to know exactly who is coming in, if there are communicable disease concerns, and where the final resting place is.
It establishes this unbroken chain of custody.
It does. And the linchpin for all of this, the key that unlocks the entire bureaucratic fortress, is the medical signature on the death certificate.
Right, because without that ink, the machine is frozen.
The originating state won't issue the transit permit without it.
Which raises a really terrifying scenario for families. Because the law operates on business hours, right?
Unfortunately, yes, it often does.
So what happens if a loved one passes away on a Friday night, going into a long holiday weekend, and the doctor isn't there to sign?
What happens is an agonizing waiting period.
You're just stuck.
You're completely stuck. The family's mourning process, scheduling the funeral, finding closure, it's literally halted by a missing signature.
That is brutal. The jurisdiction just supersedes your emotional timeline.
The legal boundaries are absolute. If the doctor's out until Tuesday, the body does not move until Tuesday.
Just staggering helplessness. You're waiting on a green light from an office that's closed.
Which is why families absolutely cannot navigate this alone.
Yeah, let's talk about the unsung quarterbacks here. The funeral directors.
They are placed right at the center of this entire operation.
Because they're not just event planners, right? We
Right.
think of them arranging flowers and handing out tissues.
They are functioning as legal experts and interstate navigators. They have to understand granular state and federal regulations.
Which aren't even uniform across the country.
You know, the laws in New York might be totally different from the statutes in Texas. And then you have federal transportation mandates layered on top of that.
And you actually need two of them, right? An originating funeral home and a receiving funeral home.
Yes, and the coordination between them is critical. The originating home handles initial custody, local permits, and getting the deceased to the state line or airport.
While the receiving home takes legal custody the second the remains arrive in the new state.
Exactly. They handle entry permits and final arrangements.
I picture it like this highly sensitive relay race. But the baton is someone's deceased family member.
That's a great way to look at it. And these two homes, who might be 1,000 miles apart and have never spoken before, have to execute a perfect handoff.
Just to ensure what the text calls a seamless transition.
And that transition depends entirely on precise logistical communication. Because if there's a single error on the burial transit permit,
Oh man, what happened?
the receiving funeral home might be legally barred from taking custody at the destination airport.
That would be catastrophic. Your loved one just stranded in a cargo facility because of a clerical error.
It highlights the massive amount of invisible labor the funeral industry absorbs.
They really do. You don't see them on the phone at 2 in the morning arguing with a health department official to expedite a permit.
No, they act as a heat shield. They absorb that friction so the family doesn't have to feel the cold mechanics of the supply chain.
And as if the paperwork wasn't daunting enough, we have to talk about the physical reality. Biology does not wait for bureaucracy.
It certainly doesn't. And that dictates some very rigid physical preparations.
Embalming, right.
Yes, depending on the method and timing, embalming is very often required. It's explicitly linked to distance and the probability delays.
Because if a body is going from Seattle to Miami, that timeline isn't measured in hours, it's measured in days.
Sometimes a week or more. You have medical examiner delays, permit processing, flight layovers, tarmac holds in the summer heat.
So embalming is a chemical process to ensure preservation through all those unpredictable variables.
Exactly, and to protect public health.
Mm.
But if embalming is skipped, maybe for religious reasons, refrigeration steps in as the mandatory alternative.
So they have to be kept in a strictly monitored, temperature-controlled environment right up until transport.
Right. But beyond preservation, we also have to talk about containment.
The vessel. And this part really stopped me in my tracks when I was reading the source. The air transport tray.
Ah, yes. The air transport tray. It's a highly specialized piece of logistics equipment.
It's such a stark image. What does it actually mean that we have industrial containers just to integrate human remains into commercial flight logistics?
It speaks to the absolute compliance required by massive cargo networks. An air transport tray isn't for aesthetics, it's for industrial utility.
What does it even look like?
It typically has a solid, heavy wooden base with handles for forklifts, and then it's covered by a rigid, heavy-duty corrugated cardboard hood.
Wow,
I
so it's
know.
literal freight packaging.
It is. It protects the deceased, it protects the casket if there is one, but crucially, it protects the aircraft and the other cargo from biological hazards.
It's just such a jarring contrast to how we travel in life.
How do you mean?
Well, in life, you buy a ticket, you walk onto the plane autonomously, you sit in your seat, and you watch a movie.
But in death, making that exact same journey, your autonomy is gone.
Completely gone. You require chemical preparation, a legal passport, and a government-approved industrial container just to get on the plane.
You transition from an autonomous passenger to highly regulated synthetic cargo.
So let's actually break down how that cargo moves. The source talks about ground fleets versus commercial air travel.
Right. Ground transport is usually for shorter regional distances, like moving someone from New Jersey to Pennsylvania.
Using a hearse or a discrete transport van.
Exactly. And the funeral director maintains a direct, unbroken chain of custody. They drive across the state line and hand them directly to the receiving home.
Point A to point B, but air transport is a whole different beast.
It introduces massive third-party corporate entities into the grieving process. Airlines and commercial cargo logistics.
And airlines are totally blind to grief, right?
Yeah.
They just care about flight schedules, weight limits, and hazardous material rules.
Exactly. And you can't just show up to the Delta cargo desk with a casket.
Right. The text mentions TSA regulations.
Post 9/11 security regulations require the shipping funeral home to be vetted as a known shipper with the TSA.
So a family literally cannot bypass the funeral home for this. They are legally locked out of shipping human remains themselves.
The funeral home is the authorized middleman between the family and the Federal Aviation Security Apparatus.
Which brings up a crazy realization. Next time you're on a commercial flight, there is likely a highly coordinated cargo operation happening right beneath your feet.
It's very likely. Human remains are transported every single day alongside passenger luggage and standard commercial freight.
While you're up there eating pretzels in row 14.
It's true. And the funeral director buffers the family from all of this. They handle the volumetric weight calculations, the hazardous material guidelines for dry ice.
Could you imagine a grieving widow trying to negotiate a cargo drop-off window at an industrial warehouse?
It would be a secondary trauma. The funeral directors completely insulate the family from the cold reality of treating a loved one as freight.
But of course, all the specialized coordination comes with a bill. The financial equation is a massive factor here.
It's significant. Costs can range from several hundred to several $1,000s.
Because you aren't just paying for a flight, you're paying for embalming, transport fees, airline charges, and the services of both funeral homes.
That's the part that catches families off guard.
Yeah.
You are hiring two separate professional businesses to coordinate one event.
So you're paying the originating home for prep and local permits, the airline for volumetric weight cargo fees, and the receiving home for entry permits and the actual funeral.
Exactly. And the text advises families to request detailed estimates and explore options that align with their budget.
Which is sound financial advice, but emotionally.
It's fraught with intense guilt and shame.
Right. How difficult is it for a family, absolutely reeling from a loss, to sit in an office and negotiate a budget?
There's this unspoken fear that if you put a price limit, it looks like you don't care.
Like you're being stingy with your final act of love.
It's a very common vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
Society implicitly suggests that money spent equals love felt. But requesting estimates is a necessary mechanism to protect the family's future.
Financial ruin does not honor the deceased.
Precisely. A good funeral director will provide an itemized list and help the family navigate choices without judgment. It's essential to talk about the money.
And talking about options brings us to a massive pivot point in this process: cremation.
Cremation is an increasingly popular alternative, and when you look at the crushing logistics we just unpacked, it's easy to see why.
It totally rewrites the logistical playbook.
It does.
Mm.
By transforming the physical state of the remains from biological tissue to inert ash, you eliminate the need for embalming.
You eliminate the need for refrigeration, the massive air transport trays, the crazy airline cargo fees.
You're bypassing the entire bureaucratic machine of biological preservation.
I like to think of traditional transport like moving a fragile, priceless artifact via highly regulated, climate-controlled freight.
A heavy, slow, expensive supply chain.
But cremation allows the loved one to travel right alongside the family, outside the industrial cargo system.
Yes, you can ship cremated remains via postal services or carry them on an airplane.
Wait, you can just bring them as a carry-on?
You can. You're still subject to TSA rules, so you need a non-metallic urn, like wood or plastic, that can go through the X-ray machine.
But once you clear security, your loved one sits right next to you in the cabin. Or in the overhead bin.
Not in the dark cargo hold beneath the floorboards. Or, as the text notes, they could be shipped via the United States Postal Service.
Only USPS, right, not FedEx or UPS.
Correct. USPS is the only legal domestic carrier for cremated remains.
This option provides something so rare in grief. Flexibility.
It really shifts the power dynamics.
Yeah. For the last hour, we've talked about families being totally powerless, at the mercy of state clerks and airline schedules.
But cremation puts control back in their hands. You decide what day to travel, what airline to fly.
That restoration of agency has to be a huge psychological relief.
It really is. It quiets the external noise so they can focus on mourning. But we do have to acknowledge that cremation isn't an option for everyone.
Right. Culture and religion play a huge role here.
Many traditions dictate highly specific, non-negotiable preparation and burial practices.
You can't just choose cremation for logistical convenience if it violates your faith.
And this is where ancient faith and modern bureaucracy create intense friction.
Oh, absolutely. Like, the text mentions traditions that require swift burials.
Yes, Orthodox Judaism and Islam traditionally stipulate burial as soon as possible, ideally within 24 hours.
Okay, wait. A 24-hour religious mandate running headfirst into a state bureaucracy that takes a 4-day weekend just to sign a permit.
It's the ultimate stress test of the system.
How does a funeral director even solve that? That sounds like an unresolvable systemic failure.
It requires frantic, highly coordinated effort. The director leverages every contact they have. They call the medical examiner directly, pleading for a signature.
They're physically walking the paperwork into the office instead of using a portal?
Exactly. They bypass standard cargo booking and find the earliest possible flight, maybe even using specialized couriers. It's a desperate race against an unyielding clock.
That places an immense amount of pressure on the family and the funeral director, just to bend the logistics of the modern world to meet their faith.
It does. And to help families navigate these overwhelming options, the text brings up digital empowerment.
Right, digital resources like the funeral program site.
They offer templates, educational content, and guidance to empower families.
I have to admit, I was skeptical of this at first. How does a website or a template actually provide compassionate in-service?
We usually think of tech as cold and sterile, right?
Exactly. Compassion is human to human.
But going back to what we discussed earlier, accessible, clear information is a form of empathy.
Because clarity is emotional triage.
Yes. When a family is vulnerable to making rushed, expensive decisions, a platform that calmly lays out the steps is a lifeline.
It strips away the vulnerability. It bridges the gap between emotional needs and logistical requirements.
A website doesn't replace a hug, but it provides the structural support they desperately need so they don't collapse under the weight of it all.
It gives them a map. But honestly, the only true way to spare a family from this entire nightmare is to navigate it for them in advance.
Pre-need arrangements, the absolute gold standard.
The text mentions that planning ahead alleviates future burdens.
By making these choices while you are healthy and clear-minded, you remove the agonizing decision-making burden from your family.
You write it down, you fund it, you formalize the plan. It's like the ultimate selfless gift.
It is a profound act of love. You lock in the decisions and the costs. When the time comes, the family only has to make one phone call.
The machine still turns, but the family is shielded from the gears.
They are spared the trauma of the invisible logistics.
Which really brings us full circle. We have traversed a massive invisible infrastructure today.
We started with the jarring collision of legal logistics and human grief.
We went through the two-state labyrinth of transit permits and medical signatures.
We looked at the unsung role of funeral directors running a high-stakes relay race.
The rigid physical realities of embalming and those industrial air transport trays.
The hidden cargo operations right beneath our feet on commercial flights.
The harsh financial realities of paying two separate businesses.
The pivot to cremation and how it returns agency to the family.
And finally, the friction of cultural needs and the empathy of digital tools and pre-planning.
It's a lot to process, But remember, having this framework downloaded into your brain now is proactive self-care.
So when the inevitable happens, the machine won't surprise you. Before we go, I want to leave you with one final, slightly philosophical thought based on the text. Think about the invisible state lines you cross every day on road trips without a second thought.
You pass a sign that says, "Welcome to Ohio," and you don't even tap the brakes.
Right. But in death, those invisible borders suddenly materialize into massive legal walls requiring permits, coroners, and coordination to cross.
It's sobering.
It really makes you wonder how much of our legal identity and bodily autonomy is intrinsically tied to the exact jurisdiction we happen to be standing in when the clock stops.
In life, we belong to ourselves. In death, we temporarily become a highly regulated liability of the state.
It certainly changes how you look at a map. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions and always try to look past the surface of the everyday systems around you.